The New York Post is an American daily newspaper, primarily distributed in New York City and its surrounding area. It is the 13th oldest and 7th most widely circulated newspaper in the United States. Established in 1801 by Federalist Alexander Hamilton, it became a respected broadsheet in the 19th century, under the name New York Evening Post. Since 1993, the Post has been owned by News Corporation, which had owned it previously from 1976 to 1988. Its editorial offices are located at 1211 Avenue of the Americas, in New York City, New York. The modern version of the paper is written in tabloid format and since its change of ownership has transitioned to sensationalism and yellow journalism. History: The New York Post, established on November 16, 1801 as the New York Evening Post, describes itself as the nation's oldest continuously published daily newspaper. The Hartford Courant, believed to be the oldest continuously published newspaper, was founded in 1764 as a semi-weekly paper. It did not begin publishing daily until 1836. The New Hampshire Gazette, which has trademarked its claim of being the nation's oldest newspaper, was founded in 1756, also as a weekly. Moreover, since the 1890s it has been published only for weekends. 19th century. The Post was founded by Alexander Hamilton with about $10,000 from a group of investors in the autumn of 1801 as the New York Evening Post, a broadsheet. Hamilton's co-investors included other New York members of the Federalist Party, such as Robert Troup and Oliver Wolcott, who were dismayed by the election of Thomas Jefferson as U.S. President and the rise in popularity of the Democratic-Republican Party. The meeting at which Hamilton first recruited investors for the new paper took place in then-country weekend villa that is now Gracie Mansion. Hamilton chose William Coleman as his first editor. The most famous 19th-century New York Evening Post editor was the poet and abolitionist William Cullen Bryant. So well respected was the New York Evening Post under Bryant's editorship, it received praise from the English philosopher John Stuart Mill, in 1864. In the summer of 1829, Bryant invited William Leggett, the Locofoco Democrat, to write for the paper. There, in addition to literary and drama reviews, Leggett began to write political editorials. Leggett's classical liberal philosophy entailed a fierce opposition to central banking, a support for voluntary labor unions, and a dedication to laissez-faire economics. He was a member of the Equal Rights Party. Leggett became a co-owner and editor at the Post in 1831, eventually working as sole editor of the newspaper while Bryant traveled in Europe in 1834 through 1835. Another co-owner of the paper was John Bigelow. Born in Malden-on-Hudson, New York, John Bigelow, Sr. graduated in 1835 from Union College, where he was a member of the Sigma Phi Society and the Philomathean Society, and was admitted to the bar in 1838. From 1849 to 1861, he was one of the editors and co-owners of the New York Evening Post. In 1881 Henry Villard took control of the New York Evening Post, as well as The Nation, which became the Post's weekly edition. With this acquisition, the paper was managed by the triumvirate of Carl Schurz, Horace White and Edwin L. Godkin. When Schurz left the paper in 1883, Godkin became editor-in-chief. White became editor-in-chief in 1899, and remained in that role until his retirement in 1903. In 1897, both publications passed to the management of Villard's son, Oswald Garrison Villard, a founding member of both the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the American Civil Liberties Union. 20th century, Villard sold the paper in 1918. After widespread allegations of pro-German sympathies during World War I hurt its circulation. In 1948 the Bronx Home News merged with it. The new owner was Thomas Lamont, a senior partner in the Wall Street firm of J.P. Morgan and Company. Unable to stem the paper's financial losses, he sold it to a consortium of 34 financial and reform political leaders, headed by Edwin Francis Gay, dean of the Harvard Business School, whose members included Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Conservative Cyrus H. K. Curtis, a publisher of the Ladies' Home Journal, purchased the New York Evening Post in 1924 and briefly turned it into a non-sensational tabloid in 1933. In 1934, J. David Stern purchased the paper, changed its name to the New York Post, and restored its broadsheet size and liberal perspective. In 1939, Dorothy Schiff purchased the paper. Her husband, George Backer, was named editor and publisher. Her second editor, Ted Thackeray, became co-publisher and co-editor with Schiff in 1942. Together, they recast the newspaper into its current tabloid format. In 1949, James Batchelor became editor of the paper, running both the news and the editorial pages. In 1961, he turned over the news section to Paul Sand and remained as editorial page editor until 1980. Under Schiff's tenure, the Post was devoted to liberalism, supporting trade unions and social welfare, and featured some of the most popular columnists of the time, such as Joseph Cookman, Drew Pearson, Eleanor Roosevelt, Max Lerner, Murray Kempton, Pete Hamill, and Eric Savariad, in addition to theater critic Richard Watts, Jr. and Broadway columnist Earl Wilson. Murdoch ownership. In 1976, Rupert Murdoch bought the Post for $30.5 million. The Post at this point was the only surviving afternoon daily in New York City, and its circulation under Schiff had grown by two-thirds, particularly after the failure of the competing World Journal Tribune. However, the rising cost of operating an afternoon daily in a city with worsening daytime traffic congestion, combined with mounting competition from expanded local TV news, cut into the Post's profitability, though it made money from 1949 until Schiff's final year of ownership, when it lost $500,000 under Murdoch's watch. The Post veered sharply to the right editorially, in accordance with Murdoch's views. In late October 1995, the Post announced plans to change its Monday through Saturday publication and start a Sunday edition, which it last published briefly in 1989. On April 14, 1996, the Post delivered its new Sunday edition at the cost of 50 cents per paper by keeping its size to 120 pages. The amount, significantly less than Sunday editions from competitors the Daily News and the New York Times, was part of the Post's efforts to find a niche in the nation's most competitive newspaper market. In December 2012, Murdoch announced that Jesse Angelo had been appointed publisher. Style. Murdoch imported the sensationalist tabloid journalism style of many of his Australian and British newspapers, such as The Sun. This style was typified by the Post's famous headlines such as "Headless Body and Topless Bar." In its 35th anniversary edition, New York Magazine listed this as one of the greatest headlines. It also has 5 other Post headlines in its greatest tabloid headlines list. Because of the institution of federal regulations limiting media cross-ownership after Murdoch's purchase of WNEW-TV and 4 other stations from Metro Media to launch the Fox Broadcasting Company, Murdoch was forced to sell the paper for $37.6 million in 1988 to Peter S. Calico, a real estate magnate with no news experience. When Calico declared bankruptcy in 1993, the paper was temporarily managed by Stephen Hoffenberg, a financier who later pleaded guilty to securities fraud. And, for 2 weeks, by Abe Hirschfeld, who made his fortune building parking garages. After a staff revolt against the Hoffenberg-Hirschfeld partnership, which included publication of an issue whose front page featured the iconic masthead photo of founder Alexander Hamilton with a single teardrop running down his cheek, the Post was again purchased in 1993 by Murdoch's News Corporation. This came about after numerous political officials, including Democratic Governor of New York Mario Cuomo, persuaded the Federal Communications Commission to grant Murdoch a permanent waiver from the cross-ownership rules that had forced him to sell the paper 5 years earlier. Without that FCC ruling, the paper would have shut down. Under Murdoch's renewed direction, the paper continued its conservative editorial viewpoint. Criticism. The Post has been criticized since the beginning of Murdoch's ownership for sensationalism, blatant advocacy and conservative bias. In 1980, The Columbia Journalism Review opined that the New York Post is no longer merely a journalistic problem. It is a social problem, a force for evil. Perhaps the most serious allegation against the Post is that it is willing to contort its news coverage to suit Murdoch's business needs, in particular that the paper has avoided reporting anything that is unflattering to the government of the People's Republic of China, where Murdoch has invested heavily in satellite television. Critics say that the Post allows its editorial positions to shape its story selection in news coverage. Post executive editor Stephen D. Quotso has responded that the Post broke the elitist media stranglehold on the national agenda. According to a survey conducted by Pace University in 2004, the Post was rated the least credible major news outlet in New York, and the only news outlet to receive more responses calling it not credible than credible. The Public Enemy song A Letter to the New York Post from their album Apocalypse 91. The Enemy Strikes Black is a complaint about what they believe to be negative and inaccurate coverage blacks received from the paper. The Post's coverage of the murder of Hasidic landlord Menachem Stark prompted outrage from Jewish communal leaders and public figures. Controversies. There have been numerous controversies surrounding the Post. In 1997, a national news story concerning Rebecca Sealfan's victory in the Scripps National Spelling Bee circulated. Sealfan was sponsored by the Daily News, a direct in-market competitor. The Post published a picture of her but altered the photograph to remove the name of the Daily News as printed on a placard she was wearing. On November 8, 2000, the Post printed "Bush wins" in a huge headline, although the presidential election remained in doubt because of the recount needed in Florida. Like the Post, many other newspapers around the country published a similar headline after the four major TV networks called the election for George W. Bush. On March 10, 2004, the Post re-ran, as a full-color page one photograph, a photograph that had already been run 3 days earlier in black and white on page 9, showing the 24-story suicide plunge of a New York University student, who had since been identified as 19-year-old Diana Kyan, daughter of a prominent Silicon Valley businessman. Among criticisms leveled at the Post was their addition of a tightly cropped inset photograph of Kyan, a former high school track athlete, depicting her in mid-jump from an athletic meet, giving the false impression that it was taken during her fatal act, despite the fact that she had fallen face up. On July 6, 2004, the Post ran an article claiming to have learned exclusively that Senator John Kerry, the Democratic Party's presidential nominee-in-waiting, had selected former House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt to be the party's vice presidential nominee. The article, under the headline "Kerry's Choice," ran without a byline. The next day, the Post had to print a news story, "Kerry's Real Choice," reporting Kerry's actual selection of Senator John Edwards of North Carolina as his running mate. On April 21, 2006, several Asian American advocacy groups protested the use of the headline "Walk This Way" for a Post article about Bush's meeting with the Hu Jintao, President of the People's Republic of China. On September 27, 2006, the Post published an article called "Powder Puff Spooks Keith" that made fun of Countdown host Keith Olbermann receiving an anthrax threat from an unknown terrorist. On December 7, 2006, the Post doctored a front-page photograph to depict the co-chairmen of the Iraq Study Group, James Baker and Lee Hamilton, in primate fur, under the headline "Surrender Monkeys," inspired by a once-used line from The Simpsons. In defense of the "Surrender Monkeys" headline, media contributor Simon Dumenko wrote an Ad Age article about his love for the Post. On February 18, 2009, the Post ran a cartoon by Sean D. Lonas that depicted a white police officer saying to another white police officer who has just shot a chimpanzee on the street, "They'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill." The cartoon duly referred to President Obama and to the recent rampage of Travis, a former chimpanzee actor. It was criticized as being in bad taste, primarily by making a reference to the racist stereotype of African Americans being portrayed as apes. Civil rights activist Al Sharpton called the cartoon troubling at best given the historic racist attacks of African Americans as being synonymous with monkeys. The Post has defended itself by stating that the cartoon was deliberately misinterpreted by its critics. On December 4, 2012, The Post used a picture taken by a freelance photographer, Arabasi, of a 58-year-old man identified as Ki-Suk Han struggling to climb back up onto the platform 49th Street station in New York City as a subway train approached. The caption on the front read, "Pushed on the subway track, this man is about to die on top," and doomed in large, bold-faced print on the bottom. The image caused outrage among many, as its use was viewed as exploiting a tragedy for commercial gain. Abasi stated that he was not strong enough to pull the man up, and attempted to use the flash on his camera to alert the driver of the oncoming train. Aspects of the Post's coverage of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings were criticized. The Post reported in several stories on the day of the attack that the death toll was 12, while most organizations reported 2 and then 3 fatalities. In addition, they reported that a Saudi national was being held as a suspect, but Boston police denied this and said they had no suspects in custody. Additionally, the April 18 cover of the Post featured a full-page photo of 2 young men the paper described as being sought by law enforcement in possible connection with the attack. CBS News reporter John Miller reported that the 2 men are not considered suspects by the FBI. The apparent insinuation by the Post that they were suspects was denounced by media critics. In June 2013, the 2 men sued the Post for libel over the story. On January 5, 2014, following the abduction and gruesome murder of Jewish Brooklyn businessman Menachem Stark, the Post cover story featured a picture of the victim dressed in his traditional Hasidic garb accompanied by the headline asking, "Who didn't want him dead?" That front page sparked outrage for its insinuation that the murder was justified vigilantism. On that same day, some New York City elected officials condemned the Post's cover story. In a press conference led by Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, New York City public advocate Letitia James declared, "Today, the New York Post has given license to murder." James then asked that every government official should refrain from advertising in the New York Post, every government official should withdraw any governmental notice from the New York Post, and everyone should condemn the New York Post. The Post and the Daily News often take pot shots at each other's work and accuracy, particularly in their respective gossip page items. In certain editions of the February 14, 2007, newspaper, an article referring to then-Senator Hillary Clinton's support base for her 2008 presidential run referred to then-Senator Barack Obama as Osama. The paper realized its error and corrected it for the later editions and the website. The Post noted the error and apologized in the February 15, 2007, edition. Earlier, on January 20, 2007, the Post received some criticism for running a potentially misleading headline, "Osama Mud Flies at Obama," for a story that discussed rumors that Obama had been raised as a Muslim and concealed it. Operations, website. In 1996, the Post launched an internet version of the paper nypost.com. The original site included color photos and sections broken down into news, sports, editorial, gossip, entertainment and business. It also had an archive for the past 7 days. Since then, it has been redesigned a number of times, with the latest incarnation launched on September 6, 2009. In 2005 the website implemented a registration requirement but removed it in July 2006. The current website also features continually updated breaking news, entertainment, business, and sports blogs. Links to Page 6 magazine. Photo and video galleries. Original Post videos. User-submitted photos and comments. And streaming video for live events. Highlights. The paper is well known for its sports section, which has been praised for its comprehensiveness. It begins on the back page, and among other coverage, contains columns about sports in the media by Phil Mushnick. The Post is also well known for its gossip columnist Cindy Adams. The best-known gossip section is Page 6, created by James Brady and currently edited by Emily Smith. February 2006 saw the debut of Page 6 magazine, distributed free inside the paper. In September 2007, it started to be distributed weekly in the Sunday edition of the paper. In January 2009, publication of Page 6 magazine was cut to 4 times a year. Sales. The daily circulation of the Post decreased in the final years of the Schiff era from 700,000 in the late 1960s to approximately 418,000 by the time she sold the paper to Murdoch in 1976. Under Murdoch, the Post launched a morning edition to compete directly with the rival tabloid Daily News in 1978, prompting the Daily News to retaliate with a PM edition called Daily News Tonight. But the PM edition suffered the same problems with worsening daytime traffic that the Afternoon Post experienced, and the Daily News ultimately folded Tonight in 1981. By that time, circulation of the all-day Post soared to a peak of 962,000, the bulk of the increase attributed to its morning edition. But the Post lost so much money that Murdoch decided to shut down the Post's PM edition in 1982, turning the Post into a morning-only daily. The Post and the Daily News have been locked in a bitter circulation war ever since. A resurgence during the first decade of the 21st century saw Post circulation rise to 724,748 by April 2007, achieved partly by lowering the price from 50 cents to 25 cents. In October 2006, the Post for the first time surpassed the Daily News in circulation, only to see the Daily News overtake its rival a few months later. As of April 2010, the Post's daily circulation is 525,004, just 10,000 behind the Daily News. Yet the Post has remained unprofitable since Murdoch first purchased it from Dorothy Schiff in 1976, and was on the brink of folding when Murdoch bought it back in 1993. With at least one media report in 2012 indicating that the Post loses up to $70 million a year. One commentator has suggested that the Post cannot become profitable as long as the competing Daily News survives, and that Murdoch may be trying to force the Daily News to fold or sell out. Recent headquarters. The 1906 Old New York Evening Post building is a designated landmark. From 1926, the newspaper's main office was at 75 West Street. In 1967, Schiff bought 210 South Street, the former headquarters of the New York Journal-American, which closed a year earlier. The building became an instantly recognizable symbol for the Post. In 1995, owner Rupert Murdoch relocated the Post's news and business offices to the News Corporation headquarters tower at 1211 Avenue of the Americas in Midtown Manhattan. The Post shares this building with Fox News Channel and the Wall Street Journal, both of which are also owned by Murdoch. The Post and the New York City edition of the Journal are printed at a state-of-the-art printing plant in the borough of the Bronx. Cultural references. In his 1984 novel Bright Lights, Big City, J. McInerney chronicled the saga of the fictional coma baby in the Post. In 1984 also, a sadistic torturer in the film Top Secret was identified as Klaus, a moron who knows only what he reads in the New York Post. See also: Media of New York City, references. Further reading: Crichton, Simon. The Last Godfather, The Rise and Fall of Joey Massino. New York, Berkeley, 2006. ISBN 0-425-20939-3. Felix, Antonia, and the editors of the New York Post. The Post's New York, celebrating 200 years of New York City as seen through the pages and pictures of the New York Post. New York, Harper Resource, 2001. ISBN 0-06-621135-2. Flood, John, and Jim McHugh. People v. Newspaper and Mail Deliverers Union of New York and Vicinity. Organized Crime and Political Corruption. Access June 5, 2008. Nardizza, Robert. Longtime Bonanno Organized Crime Family Soldiers Baldessere Amato and Stephen Locurto, and Bonanno Crime Family Associate Anthony Brazile, convicted of racketeering conspiracy. The United States Attorney's Office, Eastern District of New York press release. July 12, 2006. Access June 5, 2008. The People of the State of New York, v. Richard Cantarella, Frank Cantarella, Anthony Michel, Vincent D. Sario, Corey Ulmthal, Michael Fargo, Gerard Balboa, Anthony Tuzio. Penal Law, a Web. Access June 5, 2008. Robbins, Tom. The Newspaper Racket, Tough Guys and Wise Guys in the Truck Drivers Union. The Village Voice, March 7, Euro 13, 2001. Access June 5, 2008. External links, Top World News, official website, New York Post circulation and readership, New York Post Facebook page, New York Post Twitter page, New York Post iPad app, New York Post iPhone app, New York Post Android phone app, New York Post for Kindle Fire.